Welcome to City Vision University's podcast, providing book summaries of books on rescue missions, city missions, and the Salvation Army. So, I want you to just imagine this for a second. Imagine a massive, sprawling city block, prime real estate, worth millions of dollars.
Right.
And inside the buildings on this block, you have hundreds of, society's most desperate, addicted, and traumatized people all living together. I mean, men fresh out of prison, runaway teenagers, stranded refugee families, unwed mothers.
A hugely complex mix of people.
Exactly. Now, imagine trying to manage that entire empire, keeping the peace, providing medical care, serving thousands of meals, but doing all of that without a single standardized policy. No corporate intake forms, no bureaucratic rulebook at all.
Which, it just sounds like a recipe for absolute disaster. From a modern organizational standpoint, you're describing an uninsurable liability.
It sounds completely impossible, but today we're going to look at a man and a woman who did exactly that. And they didn't just survive, they built one of the most effective social safety nets in their entire region. So we're doing a deep dive into an incredible historical text called More Done Than Said: Stories of the Union Mission Fairmont, West Virginia, 1930s to 1970s.
Yeah, and it's compiled by Fran Perry, featuring the firsthand remembrances of her mother, Fay Perry.
Right, and through these, highly granular ground-level stories, you are about to discover a literal masterclass in leadership, radical hospitality, and how prioritizing people over policies actually works in the real world.
And, the real value of this specific text is that it is not written by some academic theorist who's just, observing poverty from a university tower.
No, not at all.
Fran Perry grew up watching this happen, literally from the window of her father's house. She sat on the third step of a winding wooden staircase in her own home, just watching the most broken elements of society walk through her front door and, get rebuilt. So we are getting the raw, unfiltered mechanics of what happens when a massive rescue mission operates as a family rather than an institution.
Okay, so to understand how you even begin to build a multi-million-dollar safe haven out of the ashes of the Great Depression, you have to look at the architects. Before we get into the massive scale of the buildings, we have to talk about Joe and Fay Perry.
Yes, you really have to.
Because you absolutely cannot separate the incredible things Joe Perry accomplished from the profound darkness of his own past.
No, you can't. His history was basically the engine of his methodology. So Joe was a native of Charleston, West Virginia, and he actually wore this very specific label, almost like a badge of honor.
Yeah.
He called himself the original dropout.
The original dropout.
Yeah. He ended his formal schooling in the 7th grade.
Which, if we think about the early 1900s, wasn't entirely uncommon, but for Joe, it wasn't a lack of intelligence.
Oh, not at all.
The classroom setting was just agonizingly slow and confining for him. He was a deeply inquisitive, high-energy kid who preferred being in the woods, observing nature, and just spending hours in the public library.
And that is a crucial distinction. Leaving school didn't mean he stopped his education. He was an incredibly voracious reader. There's this defining detail in the text where it mentions Joe carried a physical dictionary with him at all times.
Literally everywhere.
Everywhere. If he was in the middle of reading a book or even, in the middle of a conversation with someone and he encountered a word he didn't fully grasp, he would stop everything, pull out his dictionary, and look it up on the spot.
That's amazing.
He built this incredible vocabulary and a capacity for almost instantaneous recall purely through his own self-directed discipline.
It's the kind of obsessive, self-driven learning that you see in highly successful people today. You look at modern business culture and we idolize the disruptor, right?
Oh, absolutely.
We celebrate the tech founder who drops out of a prestigious university because the traditional curriculum is slowing them down, and then they go build $1 billion software empire in a garage.
Right, exactly.
Joe Perry basically took that exact same dropout disruptor energy, but instead of writing code to, optimize ad revenue, he used it to build a decentralized physical network of human rehabilitation. He was a credential-less leader who later in life was actually invited to give commencement and baccalaureate addresses to graduating college classes.
But, before he gave any addresses, he really had to survive his own self-destruction. As a young man, he spent a few years working in the printing trade. But he got completely swallowed whole by the illicit economy of the 1920s and 30s.
Yeah, things got really dark.
Very dark. He developed a severe, debilitating addiction to alcohol. For 8 agonizing years, he was completely entrenched in that world in Charleston.
And The book shares this moment that really captures just how far he fell. It's an anecdote where a woman stops him on the street and asks, are you the Joe Perry that drinks or the one that plays the fiddle?
Ouch.
Yeah. And Joe, standing there just utterly humiliated, has to confess that he never played the fiddle.
Which is brutal, because he was working in a cigar store, but the cigars were just a front.
Right.
The real business happening in the back room was heavy gambling and moonshining. And we need to clarify what moonshining meant in that specific era.
Yeah, this wasn't artisanal craft distilling in a mason jar.
Exactly. This was the unregulated, highly dangerous, illicit alcohol trade. The liquor was often cut with toxic substances just to increase profits. It was a gritty, incredibly dangerous environment, and Joe was right at the center of it.
Which eventually led to his rock bottom moment. It all culminated in this terrifying physical crisis. Joe actually suffered an episode of temporary total blindness.
Yeah, and from a medical perspective, given his heavy involvement in the moonshine trade, this was likely a form of toxic optic neuropathy.
Because of the alcohol.
Right. It's often caused by methanol poisoning from improperly distilled alcohol. Methanol attacks the optic nerve directly. It is a terrifying, literally blinding realization that the substance you are addicted to is actively destroying your central nervous system.
So he loses his sight. And in that terrifying darkness, he has a profound spiritual awakening. The text basically describes it as his senses finally returning to him. He resolves to get his life on track. And eventually, his vision does return, his faith is restored, and he views the entire ordeal as a divine intervention.
A total turning point.
Yeah, from that exact moment, he dedicates the rest of his breathing life to pulling other people out of the exact same chemical and spiritual ruin that he had just survived.
And this is where we really have to establish a core principle of Joe's leadership. Because in the 1930s, the landscape of charity was largely defined by this bureaucratic concept of deserving versus the undeserving poor.
Ah, yes, the clipboard approach.
Precisely. If you wanted a meal or a bed from an institution, you often had to prove your moral purity to a social worker. You had to prove you were a victim of circumstance, not, a victim of your own vices.
But Joe's lived experience completely neutralized that power dynamic.
Exactly. When a man walked into the mission, reeking of cheap liquor, having just gambled away his family's rent money, Joe didn't see a moral failure to be categorized.
He saw himself.
Yes. He saw himself standing in the back of that cigar store. He possessed this deeply lived empathy. He approached the so-called unemployable without a single shred of judgment because he knew exactly how thin the line was between the man behind the desk and the man begging for a meal.
So he gets sober, he starts doing fundraising for a mission in Charleston, and he's highly successful because he has this sharp wit, deep wisdom, and undeniable charisma. And this is where Fay Summers enters the story. Now, Fay is a completely different personality profile.
Completely different. She is really the structural counterweight to Joe. She is 7 years younger, loved formal schooling, excelled in art, and was a highly energetic, popular young woman.
Right.
Furthermore, she had secured an office job with an insurance company right out of high school. And, in the post-Depression economy, for a young woman to hold a steady clerical job was a massive achievement. It speaks to her profound competence and organizational skill.
She was also heavily involved in church youth groups, and that's where the collision happens. Joe is brought in as a guest speaker to outline the goals of the Charleston mission to a room of like 200 people. Fay is in the audience. They both end up elected as president and treasurer of a youth organizational committee.
They connect over this immense shared drive for service.
Yeah, and they get married in October 1937. And the detail about their honeymoon is just, it's the perfect foreshadowing of their entire life together.
Oh, it really is. They took a 2-day Greyhound bus ride, followed immediately by a streetcar ride directly into Fairmont, West Virginia, to take over a newly formed, struggling mission.
That's it. That's the honeymoon.
No beach, no resort.
Right. It wasn't a romantic getaway, it was a deployment. So let's look at the reality on the ground when they arrived. May 1937. The community leaders of Fairmont, including the former governor of West Virginia, John J. Cornwell, are in a complete panic.
Because the industrial and coal economies are fluctuating wildly, and Marion County is suddenly flooded with unemployed people.
Yes, they have a massive influx of locals losing their homes and transients riding the rails looking for work.
And the town had a glaring gap in its social safety net. They had one organization handing out meal tickets, but there was absolutely zero housing.
Wow.
You can give a starving man a ticket for a bowl of soup, sure, but when the temperature drops at night, where does he sleep? the local jail, the streets.
So the committee manages to scrape together exactly $500 from the community. $500. I mean, even adjusted for inflation, that's maybe around $10,000 today.
Yeah.
It's nothing when you are trying to house a city's homeless population.
Right. It's barely a fraction of a modern budget.
They rent a tiny storeroom at 1111 Jackson Street. A local paper later noted that this storeroom literally had the look and smell of poverty.
And when Joe arrived to get the building in order, they didn't even have beds. Joe and the transient men who were seeking shelter had to go find scrap lumber and hammer together homemade benches and bunk beds just to get the operation off the floor.
Okay, here is where my modern organizational brain starts flashing red warning lights. Because it doesn't stay a storeroom. Over the next few decades, this $500 storefront operation explodes.
It really does.
By the 1970s, the Union Mission owned an entire city block in Fairmont. The assessed value was nearly $2 million in 1970s money.
Massive scale.
They had a main building, friendly homes, a chapel, a bookstore. They even bought and converted a historic red brick courthouse into a church. Now, I understand they were compassionate, but compassion doesn't balance a multi-million-dollar ledger.
No, it doesn't.
When you scale an operation that large, dealing with thousands of unpredictable, often addicted individuals, you have to systematize. You need intake forms, liability waivers, behavioral contracts, and strict security protocols. How on earth did they survive this massive growth without turning into a rigid, bureaucratic institution?
Well, you're hitting on the absolute central paradox of the Union Mission. How do you maintain the ethos of people over policies at a multi-million-dollar scale? The answer is that they utilized a completely different operating system. They didn't build a corporation, they built an extended family network.
But a family of hundreds of people, that sounds like absolute chaos. If a resident gets violent or if someone steals from the kitchen, you can't just put them in timeout. Without a policy manual, how do you actually maintain order?
You maintain order through shared ownership and mutual accountability rather than top-down enforcement. Fran Perry describes growing up with unwanted children from our society at our front door. She writes that because the people arriving had no parents, she simply shared hers. When a transient man walked into the mission, he wasn't processed as a client by some paid staff member. He was welcomed as a brother or an uncle. And here's the mechanical secret to their scale. The people being rescued were the ones doing the rescuing.
Oh, I see. So it wasn't Joe and Fay managing a massive payroll of social workers.
Exactly. The men who came for a bed built the next set of beds. The women who came for shelter cooked the meals for the new arrivals. When you treat someone as a liability, you have to write a policy to contain them. But when you give someone actual responsibility,
right?
When you tell a man who has been completely discarded by society that the survival of the mission depends on his ability to manage the boiler room or chop the wood, you restore his dignity. The community polices itself because everyone has a stake in the survival of the home.
I see. The social pressure of a community relying on you is infinitely more powerful than a signature on a behavioral contract. But I want to get out of the theoretical here. To really understand how Fay and Joe avoided becoming bureaucrats, we need to look at the granular day-to-day interactions. Let's look at what happened when specific crises knocked on that front door.
And the crises were constant. The book details several micro-interventions that highlight this family philosophy in action. Let's look at the runaway teenagers.
Yes, there's a story of a 15-year-old boy. He ran away from home and somehow, out of desperation or hiding, got himself locked inside a railroad freight car. He was trapped in this dark boxcar for 4 straight days.
Which is, just think about the physiological trauma of that. 4 days in a fluctuating temperature environment, in total darkness, with the terrifying noise of the rails, and absolutely zero access to food or water. By the time he was discovered and brought to the mission, he would have been severely dehydrated, malnourished, and in a state of profound psychological shock.
A standardized institution would immediately call juvenile authorities, hand him over, and wash their hands of the liability.
Right. Case closed.
But the mission takes him in. They slowly rehydrate him, feed him, and let him rest. They manage to contact his parents, who wire the money for a train ticket home. But here's the brilliant detail. Fay doesn't just put him on the train. She packs him a lunch for the journey, and she gives him a small amount of extra pocket money.
And we can extract a really distinct principle here.
Yeah.
The dignity of the paying passenger.
Ooh, I like that.
Fay recognized that returning home as a runaway is an incredibly shameful experience. By giving him pocket money and a lunch, she isn't just feeding him, she is giving him back a shred of autonomy. He doesn't have to beg for food on the way back. He can walk onto that train feeling like a human being, not a criminal being deported.
That attention to the psychological state of a child is incredible. And she does it again with a 13-year-old girl. This young girl runs away, ends up at the mission, and Fay notes that the girl is absolutely terrified of being sent back home.
Now, Fay knows that legally and morally, a 13-year-old child must be returned to her guardians. There's no getting around that reality.
Right. But instead of forcing the issue immediately, which would cause the girl to panic and potentially run away again into a much more dangerous situation on the streets, Fay pulls out a pencil and a piece of paper. She sits down quietly across from the girl, and she begins to draw a sketch of her.
From a psychological standpoint, this is a masterclass in what we call de-escalation through misdirection. When a traumatized person is in a state of hyperarousal, fight or flight, direct confrontation, even a direct line of questioning, feels like an attack.
Right, it's too much pressure.
Exactly. By shifting the focus to a shared silent activity like art, Fay removes the pressure. Bringing direct, intense eye contact and focusing on the paper lowers the child's heart rate. The rhythmic sound of the pencil on paper is grounding. Fay is regulating the child's nervous system before she attempts to navigate the complex reality of getting her home safely.
It's an intervention that requires time, patience, and deep intuition. Things or rigid policies simply cannot mandate. But if we want to talk about interventions that completely shatter modern boundaries, we have to talk about how Fay handled the unwed mothers.
The historical context here is vital. In the 1940s and 50s, an out-of-wedlock pregnancy wasn't just a scandal. It was an event that could permanently ostracize a young woman and completely ruin a family's standing in the community.
So a woman from a neighboring town, Grafton, comes to Joe and Fay in a total panic. Her teenage daughter, Ida, is pregnant. The family's desperate plan is to hide Ida at the mission until the baby is born. Once the infant arrives, the grandparents plan to formally adopt the baby and raise it as their own, telling the community it's their child, essentially turning Ida into the baby's older sister.
It was a surprisingly common, albeit deeply complex, social strategy to shield young women from the devastating stigma of the era.
So Ida stays at the mission, and everything is going smoothly. But right before the delivery, Ida's mother realizes a massive flaw in their plan. If Ida and a brand new infant return to their small town on the exact same day after Ida has been visiting relatives for months, the neighbors are going to figure it out instantly.
Of course they would.
Right. So the mother comes back to Fay and begs her to find a temporary foster home to hide the newborn baby for a full month, just to stagger their return and avoid suspicion.
And Fay tries. She tries to find a placement, utilizing her network. But no one is willing to take on a secret newborn for a month.
So what does Fay Perry, the co-director of a massive, chaotic city block operation, do? She decides to keep the infant herself.
Wow.
And she doesn't put the baby in a nursery down the hall. Fay suffered from severe hearing loss. She was significantly deaf. Because she was terrified she wouldn't hear the baby crying in the night, she moves a crib into her own personal spare room and sleeps mere feet away from the infant.
I want to pause and dissect this because it is the absolute antithesis of modern social work training. Today, professionals are heavily trained in boundary setting. You do not bring a client's crisis into your own home, let alone your own bedroom.
Never.
The belief is that if you don't maintain a strict professional distance, you will burn out and be unable to help anyone.
Exactly. I look at this story and I think, Fay, you are going to destroy yourself. You have 100 transient men next door, you're running a massive kitchen, and now you're purposefully disrupting your own sleep to hide a baby for a family who is terrified of town gossip. It just feels reckless.
It feels reckless to an institution, but it makes perfect sense if you operate under the principle of absorbing the social cost. Fay wasn't just providing free childcare. She understood that this family was buckling under the crushing weight of societal shame. By taking that baby into her own physical space, Fay was literally absorbing the anxiety, the sleeplessness, and the logistical nightmare onto her own shoulders so that family could survive the transition.
She acted as a social shield. And she did the exact same thing for a young woman named Diane. The book notes that Diane was the only Black unwed mother they hosted during this specific period. Her family had sent her to the mission not just for her own sake, but because they wanted to protect her younger siblings from being bullied and taunted by their peers in their hometown.
The mission absorbed the cultural fallout. They stepped into the line of fire so the families could breathe.
There is one more story of granular intervention that really exposes the hidden supply chains of poverty. It's the story of the Arnolds. They are a young, inexperienced couple living out in the country near Mannington, and they have a 3-month-old baby girl who is in a critical health crisis. The infant weighs less than 8 pounds.
Oh my gosh.
She simply cannot keep any standard formula down and is slowly starving to death.
So the state gets involved. The Department of Human Services takes the baby to Fairmont General Hospital. But the parents live too far out in the country to commute, and they are terrified of being separated from their dying child.
So the state agency essentially shrugs and sends the parents to the Union Mission. The mission sets them up in their family shelter, which is close to the hospital, so the parents can spend every single day at their baby's bedside. The doctors try various treatments, even sending the baby to the West Virginia University Hospital.
Right.
Finally, they find a very specific, highly engineered medical formula that the baby can digest. The infant gains a few ounces, hits 9 pounds, and the doctor clears them to go home. The couple is overjoyed. They even stop by the mission's kitchen to thank the cooks before they leave.
But here's where the invisible wall of poverty suddenly appears. The medical formula that saved this baby's life cost $13 for an 8-ounce supply.
Let's contextualize that for a second. $13 today might buy you like a couple of lattes.
Okay.
But in the mid-20th century, for an impoverished rural family, $13 every few days for an 8-ounce bottle of formula is an astronomical, impossible sum.
It's financial ruin.
Yes. It means the cure is entirely out of reach and the baby will likely regress.
And this is where the mission's agility shines. A government agency might take 6 weeks to process a medical subsidy grant. This baby doesn't have 6 weeks. The book simply notes, quote, "An organization had been found to furnish the formula for her. We were wishing them the best," end quote.
Wow.
The Perrys utilized their vast informal network of donors and local organizations to instantly solve the supply chain problem.
Yeah.
They housed the parents, fed them, and then quietly orchestrated the funding for the medical formula so the family could actually survive this solution.
Which perfectly transitions us into looking at how the mission navigated massive, unprecedented crises that required split-second agility. Because they didn't just operate within the confines of their buildings, they adapted to the bizarre realities of the outside world.
Yeah, Joe Perry had a highly imaginative, almost theatrical approach to problem solving. A prime example is the church on wheels during the 1940s.
Right, so World War II is raging. The entire country is under strict gasoline and rubber rationing to support the war effort. You couldn't just go to the pump and buy gas with cash. You had to have government-issued rationing stamps. And civilian travel was severely restricted.
Because of this, the people living out in the distant coal mining camps, the haulers, could no longer travel into Fairmont to attend the mission's church services.
So Joe is standing around with the men at the mission, and he jokes, "Well, if they can't come to the church, we should put the church on wheels and take it to them." Now, in a normal organization, that's just a funny passing comment. But because Joe had empowered these men, because they possessed shared ownership, they took him literally. They actually built a mobile church.
It was a marvel of grassroots engineering. They constructed a wooden frame on a vehicle chassis and covered the entire thing in a specialized siding that mimicked the look of real brick.
But the reality of wartime logistics intervened. Because they couldn't acquire enough rationing stamps for gas, this magnificent portable brick church rolled out from behind the mission property on Cleveland Avenue and only ever made it about 10 blocks down to 10th Street.
10 blocks.
It never actually reached the haulers.
But they didn't scrap it. They parked it right there on the street and held services inside it. They even installed a small pump organ. It could seat 10 to 12 people. Imagine being a resident of Fairmont, looking out your window and seeing a literal brick church slowly rolling down your street, stopping, and hearing organ music pouring out of it.
It's absurd, but it's brilliant. It's a visual manifestation of their willingness to try anything. But the true test of their agility, and perhaps the most impressive logistical feat in the book, involves a family stranded on the interstate.
The Dominguez family. This story involves incredible geopolitical context crashing into rural West Virginia.
Here is the scenario. A family of Cuban refugees is traveling through West Virginia when their large van suffers a catastrophic breakdown right on Interstate 79. And this isn't a small family unit. It is a family of 11 people.
11. And the father, Miguel, is the patriarch, and his psychological profile is crucial here. The book notes that Miguel had literally escaped Cuba by swimming across the bay to the United States Naval Base at Guantanamo Bay. During this grueling, desperate swim for freedom, he was severely stung by jellyfish, enduring excruciating pain to reach American soil.
So this is a man who understands survival on a cellular level. He has successfully navigated the terrifying waters of the Cold War, but now he is utterly paralyzed by a broken transmission on a West Virginia highway with 10 dependents. The local police, or Good Samaritans, direct this massive family to the Union Mission.
And without a single intake form, without checking their immigration status or verifying their income, the Perrys take all 11 of them in. They become deeply integrated into the mission's ecosystem. The oldest son even starts hanging out in the industrial kitchen, begging the mission cooks for their recipes because the family loves the meal so much.
They stay at the mission for nearly a month, but Miguel is desperate to get his family back on the road before the school year starts. He finds a mechanic, but the quote to repair the van is over $2,000.
Let's analyze that number. $2,000 in that era is the equivalent of buying a new car. It is a staggering wall for a refugee family to hit.
If a family of 11 walked into a state welfare office today needing a sudden $2,000 cash grant to fix a vehicle, the bureaucracy would grind to a halt. There would be committee reviews, means testing, endless documentation, weeks of waiting. Miguel's family would be stranded indefinitely. So what does Joe Perry do? Does he fill out a grant proposal?
No. He understands the principle of transparent storytelling and leveraging social capital. Joe picks up the telephone and calls John Veazey, an editor at the Times West Virginian, the local newspaper.
He doesn't ask the government for money. He tells the editor Miguel's story, the swim to Guantanamo, the jellyfish, the broken van, the 11 stranded refugees. The editor publishes the story. And the community of Fairmont, trusting Joe Perry implicitly, responds. The money pours into the mission almost instantly. They raise the $2,000, the van is repaired, and the Domingos family gets back on the road.
This is why the people over policies model works when it's grounded in community trust. Joe bypassed the institutional red tape by directly connecting the profound need of the refugee to the inherent generosity of his community. He acted as the trusted bridge.
It's breathtaking efficiency. But Joe was constantly looking at the horizon. He realized that pulling people out of immediate crisis in a downtown city block was only phase one. To achieve deep, lasting rehabilitation, he believed people needed a radical change of environment. They needed nature, physical labor, and a sense of permanence.
This led to his most ambitious physical project, the Mission Farm and Camp. For years, Joe had dreamed of a therapeutic landscape outside the city limits. In the mid-1950s, he mobilized the men of the mission to build it.
And when we say they built it, we mean by hand. The transient men from the mission moved massive amounts of stone using only wheelbarrows. Joe paid them 50 cents a load. They constructed a massive farm dining lodge featuring a commercial kitchen and 2 massive stone fireplaces that could seat 135 people at a time. They dug a lake, built a playground, constructed a superintendent's cottage.
The local newspaper wrote a profound description of this place, calling it a sanctuary built for people discarded by society and furnishings no longer wanted. It became an engine of purpose. It was eventually managed by a couple, Art and Marie Shoemaker, who actually left their lives in Pennsylvania and took a significant pay cut just to do this work.
Wow, that's dedication.
Art was a skilled tradesman, and he used his plumbing and building expertise to maintain the farm. He even initiated a cordwood chopping venture with the men that generated $10,000 in revenue for the mission.
It sounds incredibly idyllic. It sounds like the perfect Hollywood ending to a story about charity. But this is where Fran Perry's book earns my deepest respect. She does not sanitize the history. She doesn't just print the highlight reel. She includes the devastating, complex realities where all the love, all the money, and all the effort simply fail to secure a happy ending.
Yeah, and the most poignant example of that harsh reality is the story of Betty Lou.
Let's look closely at Betty Lou's trajectory. She comes to the Union Mission broken and in need of support. Joe and Fay pour everything into her. They mentor her, support her education, and she absolutely thrives. She graduates with a degree in counseling and spiritual leadership. Fay is so proud that she personally sews the dresses for Betty Lou's 3-day graduation ceremony and buys her new shoes.
It's beautiful.
Betty Lou secures a highly respected position as a matron for unwed mothers at the Huntington City Mission. It is the ultimate success story.
Until the chaotic variables of human relationships intervene. The position in Huntington proves to be a bit socially isolating for her. While working there, she meets a man who is staying at the mission. The superintendent of the Huntington mission warns her that this man is bad news, but Betty Lou is deeply lonely and desperately wants a family. She ignores the warnings, leaves her post in Huntington, and returns to Fairmont.
And Fay's intuition immediately starts screaming. The more Betty Lou talks about this mysterious new fiancé, the more Fay is convinced the man is a grifter. Betty Lou has some internal doubts, but her desire to get married and have a baby overrides her judgment. A few months later, Betty Lou is staying at a house in a nearby community called 4 States. The fiancé walks into the Fairmont mission, asking Joe for directions to Betty Lou's house so they can finally leave together.
Joe Perry is instantly suspicious. He doesn't just give the man directions and wish him well. He taps into a fiercely protective instinct. He waits for the man to leave the building, follows him outside, and covertly writes down the license plate number of the man's vehicle.
Joe contacts the local police and has them run the plates. It turns out the car is stolen. This man had answered a classified ad to drive a woman's car to Ohio, but instead, he stole the vehicle, drove it to West Virginia, and was using it to convince Betty Lou to elope with him. Because Joe played detective, the state police intercepted the man before he could reach Betty Lou.
When the police arrest him, they search his belongings. They find photographs of a woman and young children, strongly suggesting he was already married and abandoning another family. Furthermore, they discover he had recently served time in a Midwestern penitentiary. Joe's intervention absolutely saved Betty Lou from being kidnapped by a dangerous felon.
But saving her from the con man didn't fix the underlying tragedy of her life. She was deeply, profoundly humiliated by the ordeal. She eventually married a young man from her local community, but she never was able to have the children she so desperately desired. The chronic stress of her life caught up with her. She developed severe hypertension and died of a massive stroke in her early 40s while in the back of an ambulance.
It is a sobering, necessary inclusion in the text. It shatters the illusion that mission work is a magical fix. You can provide the education, you can buy the graduation shoes, and you can even intercept the criminals. But you cannot insulate a human being from the random, devastating cruelty of life.
But the beauty of the Union Mission's legacy is that the tragedies exist right alongside multi-generational triumphs. The book contrasts Betty Lou's heartbreak with the story of a man named Mac.
Mac came to the mission as a paroled convict. The mission helped him stabilize his life and supported him through ministerial school. He eventually earned his diploma and became what the community believed to be the very first parolee to pastor in the history of Fairmont.
And the generational ripple effect is astounding. Mac marries, has a family, and his son, Rex, goes on to become an incredibly decorated United States naval officer. The book actually quotes his military commendation, which praises Rex's total dedication to duty. The trajectory shifted in a single generation, from a father in a prison cell to a son receiving military honors, all because the mission intervened.
We see that same generational impact with Lucy. Lucy was a young African-American girl who found her way to the mission. During her stay, the mission hosted a guest speaker named Mary, who was a working missionary in Africa. Lucy was so captivated by Mary's stories that the two of them stayed up talking in the mission until 4 o'clock in the morning.
That single conversation fundamentally altered Lucy's life. She decided she wanted to dedicate her life to service, but she needed formal education, which was financially out of reach. So the Union Mission stepped in and helped pay her college tuition. Joe and Fay proudly attended her graduation. She moved to Washington State, became a highly impactful bilingual English teacher, and for years afterward, she regularly mailed financial gifts back to the Fairmont mission out of deep gratitude.
What allowed Joe to facilitate these incredible transformations from Mac to Lucy was a principle we can call observation without condemnation. He constantly evaluated people's potential without judging their current deficits.
There is a hilarious, touching little story that proves this. A group of college boys from out of town get stranded in Fairmont because all the local hotels are completely booked up for a big basketball tournament. They end up sleeping on the floor of the mission. The next morning, before they leave, they write a nice thank you note to Joe.
Joe reads the note. Remember, Joe is the 7th grade dropout who taught himself to read with a pocket dictionary. He reads this note written by formerly educated college students, and he just chuckles to himself.
Right.
Why? Because he spotted 6 glaring spelling and grammatical errors in their short letter.
He noticed the flaws, but he didn't use them to diminish the boys. He saw exactly who people were, whether it was a college student who couldn't spell or a paroled convict who needed a second chance, but he never weaponized those observations.
However, we have to acknowledge the physical reality of living this way. Operating with this level of porous empathy, absorbing the trauma, the failures, and the crises of thousands of people, it exacts a brutal toll on the human body.
It really does. You don't just act as a shield for that much human wreckage without taking some heavy shrapnel yourself. Let's look at what this lifestyle cost Fay and Joe physically.
The physical toll was devastating. In 1951, Fay endured a horrific medical crisis. She was diagnosed with severe ulcerative colitis.
For listeners who might not be familiar, ulcerative colitis is a brutal autoimmune disease where the body's immune system essentially attacks the lining of the large intestine, causing severe inflammation and bleeding ulcers. In the 1950s, the medical treatments for this were incredibly limited.
It was life-threatening. Fay began hemorrhaging severely, the bleeding continued for days, and her medical team completely gave up hope. They told the family she was not going to survive.
The book recounts a deeply spiritual moment where Fay realizes that in all her prayers for comfort, she hadn't explicitly prayed for the bleeding to stop. She does so, and within an hour, the doctors are stunned to find the hemorrhaging has ceased. She still had to undergo an extensive, highly experimental surgery and face a grueling recovery. She fully attributed her survival to faith and prayer alone, but the physical devastation of that disease lingered for the rest of her life.
And Joe's burden was, in many ways, even more complex because it was invisible. We've described this highly charismatic, high-energy visionary who could talk a newspaper editor into funding a van repair and convince a room full of transient men to build a stone lodge. But the text reveals that internally, Joe suffered from chronic clinical depression.
I really want you to pause and absorb the weight of that. Joe Perry woke up every single morning with a brain chemistry that was actively stripping him of hope, telling him that everything was dark and pointless. Yet he forced himself out of bed and orchestrated the salvation of hundreds of addicted and destitute people. How do you generate light for an entire city block when you are drowning in internal darkness?
It is a testament to an ironclad conviction that his external duties superseded his internal emotional comfort. But the stress of carrying that dissonance eventually wrecked his cardiovascular system. He developed high blood pressure and heart ailments.
In the mid-1960s, despite his failing health, he was still trying to do physical labor at the mission. He was climbing a ladder to the roof of a 2-story house. The ladder hit a patch of black ice, and he fell hard. The injuries forced this high-energy man to rely on crutches and canes, which infuriated him.
A few years later, in the late 1960s, he faced a massive vascular crisis. He developed arteriosclerosis, a severe hardening and blockage of the main artery in his neck, restricting blood flow to his brain. The doctors had to operate, and they gave him a 50-50 chance of surviving the surgery. He survived it and incredibly went right back to directing the mission.
He simply refused to stop until the early 1970s. The book describes it as a profoundly dark day for the community. Joe Perry was diagnosed with ALS, commonly known as Lou Gehrig's disease.
ALS is a cruel, relentless disease. It destroys the motor neurons that control voluntary muscles. The patient slowly loses the ability to walk, speak, swallow, and eventually breathe, while their cognitive function, their mind, remains completely intact and aware of what is happening.
As his body rapidly deteriorated, the massive community he had built rallied around him. Letters of gratitude poured in from all over the country, from the people he had saved, the people he had fed, the people he had employed. The 7th grade dropout who used to sell moonshine in the back of a cigar store had become one of the most beloved and respected figures in the history of Marion County.
He had achieved his ultimate life goal. The quote that opens the book, which was Joe's guiding philosophy, is simply, "I trust it will be said of me there was more done than said."
They didn't host symposiums on the theoretical causes of poverty. They didn't draft white papers. They bled for the impoverished. Before we wrap up, I have to share one final haunting story from the text about Joe. It is a story called Angels Unawares, and it perfectly encapsulates how he viewed the world.
It is the defining interaction of his character.
It's late one evening, and Joe is walking near the mission's little chapel. He sees an old, visibly exhausted black man standing out front. Joe walks up and asks what he can do to help him. The old man looks at Joe and says, "I've come a long way today, and if you could get me a cool glass of water, I'd be very grateful." So Joe goes immediately into the house, fills a large glass with ice and cold water, and brings it out to the man. The man drinks it gratefully. Joe then tells him to come along, that he will take him down to the men's building and get him a proper, comfortable bed to sleep in for the night.
But the man softly refuses. He tells Joe, "I'm very tired. If I could just sit in here for a while, I will be just fine. I can sleep on one of the benches."
Joe, respecting the man's autonomy, agrees, and leaves him to rest in the chapel. But Joe's worried about him. Early the next morning, as soon as the sun is up, Joe goes back to the chapel to check on the man. But the chapel is empty. The old man is completely gone. No one saw him leave. They never saw him again. Joe later told his family about the strange, profound feeling that washed over him when he stood in that empty chapel. He thought of the biblical admonition about offering a cup of water and the warning that you might be entertaining angels unawares.
That story is the key to understanding how the Union Mission scaled compassion without losing its soul. If you believe that every broken, addicted, or exhausted stranger who knocks on your door might literally be a divine messenger, you do not hand them an intake form. You do not check their insurance liability. You give them the absolute best you have to offer, even if it's just a glass of ice water and a quiet bench.
So, what does this deep dive mean for you today? What is the practical blueprint we can take away from Joe and Fay Perry? The absolute core principle of this book is that true transformative impact requires proximity to the problem. You cannot fix human trauma by throwing grant money at it from afar. You cannot heal an addict by mandating a new city ordinance.
The Perrys prove that society's most vulnerable people don't need a perfectly calibrated risk-averse institution. They need a family structure. They need a community that operates on shared accountability, that evaluates them without condemning them, and that is willing to absorb the social costs of their crises.
Exactly. Joe Perry built a multi-million-dollar empire on the radical belief that people are more important than policies. So I want to leave you with a final provocative question to carry with you. Look at your own life. Look at your workplace, your local government, or the organizations you support. We exist in a modern era that is absolutely obsessed with algorithms, with mitigating legal liabilities, and enforcing standardized one-size-fits-all rules. Where in your world are we currently prioritizing rigid policy over human dignity? And what human wreckage are we actively ignoring simply because their messy reality doesn't fit neatly into an institutional checkbox?
It's a question that challenges the entire foundation of how we currently structure our social safety nets.
It demands that we rethink our boundaries. Fran Perry didn't grow up learning about poverty from a textbook. She grew up sitting on the third step of a warm wooden staircase, watching a chaotic, beautiful parade of broken humanity get rebuilt right in her living room. Maybe it's time we all stepped out from behind our policies and spent a little more time on that staircase.
Keep seeking out the stories where more is done than said.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time.